In the Bible, Paul explains that everyone has two bodies, a physical body and a spiritual body. Mediums use their spiritual bodies when they act as a communication bridge between the physical and spirit worlds. As a spirit speaks, mediums hear the information using the ears of their spiritual bodies, then repeat the information to other physical people. Mediumship is synonymous with the biblical term, gifts of the Spirit. The focus of our show, Making Known the Unknown, is to provide knowledge through the use of Reverend Hewitt's mediumship and Sidney Schwartz's research. The Bible contains the history of psychic events, along with man-made doctrines created by priests centuries ago. This show will explore the untruths which the Bible entrenched into our society. By uncovering these untruths, we encourage people everywhere to think for themselves with a critical mind.
Hello, and welcome to Making Known the Unknown. I'm your host, Tina Tarryk, and with me today are Sidney Schwartz, middle school teacher from Hackensack, New Jersey,
Hi, Tina.
and Bible researcher of over 25 years. Welcome, Sid.
Thank you.
Also with us, Reverend Carl Hewitt, founder and pastor of Gifts of the Spirit Church right here in Chesterfield, Connecticut, and medium. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you.
And welcome to our viewers. As we have reminded you in several other shows, it would be very important for you, if not now, then later, to put a recording tape into your VCR, because we have shows that will be jam-packed with information that you will probably want to refer to at some point in the future, and probably learn a little bit more each time you watch the show. Okay. With that, I wanted to let our viewers know that the topic of today's show is called the Sacred Feminine. Now, what does that mean? Why would we talk about that? Well, we're going to have a lot of fun explaining that to you. The term Sacred Feminine is actually something that's referred to in the book The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. Now, this particular book is not a book that we are promoting in terms of sales or that people should read it, but this book, which I have read, has quite a bit of information in it that seems to be very similar to many of the programs and many of the knowledge and research that has come through Sidney Schwartz and Reverend Carl Hewitt. And I found it too coincidental to leave it alone and thought that many of the topics in this particular book should be discussed. So we are going to be taking pieces out of this novel. And what I find interesting, and we can talk about this, is that there are quite a few hard-hitting facts in this book, but they're tied together very loosely in a story form. And I found it interesting. Also, a couple of friends of mine who have read this book and also watched this program have been amazed to find that quite a bit of what was researched in this book is quite a bit of what these two gentlemen have researched and have put into their first book and now coming into their second book. And I find it a little too coincidental that there are people with this knowledge in other places on this planet, and we have that same knowledge here to share with our viewers. Okay.
I would like, if you don't mind, I would like to
Go right
add
ahead.
this right at this point. It's only since the last program that we did that I heard the audio portion of that book. And so the information that's been given to me that I've shared with the people came to me a long time before I ever knew that book existed, although I have a lot of phone calls, because Carl, you've got to read this book.
And I would encourage viewers to keep in mind that if you ever do choose to purchase this book or read this book or what have you, that if you've watched these programs, you'll know exactly what we're talking about. And you will be more than amazed. I think you'll be in awe, because there is information throughout the whole book that is based on hard facts and scientific knowledge.
Yes.
And with that, one of the pieces that I found most interesting was called The Sacred Feminine. And the premise is that there is so much information that stems from the time of Mary Magdalene, who is considered sacred, that has been uncovered now, or is beginning to be uncovered, but has been covered up for thousands and thousands of years for a lot of reasons, and we're going to dive into some of those reasons. One of the first things I wanted to throw out was that there was this whole notion of the sin that was committed in the Garden of Eden with Adam taking the apple, and it seemed like that is a connection that a lot of the Bibles wanted to make, where Adam was tempted by something evil, and of course Eve was in that garden as well, and it seems like a lot of that stems from a lot of the negative connotations towards women in history have stemmed from that very moment, or that very story, I should say. And I wanted to first throw that over to Sid for some comment.
That's very true, Tina. In the New Testament, they bring that up quite a bit. That it was that in the story of in the Garden of Eden, the snake, who Christian theologians think is the devil, but in the Hebrew Bible, it's that part's not mentioned because it hadn't been developed yet. It speaks to Eve first and tempts Eve to take the apple of, excuse me, it wasn't an apple. We think it's an apple, but it's really the word in Hebrew is fruit. To take the fruit from the tree of knowledge and to eat it, and by doing so, she would gain knowledge. And this was something that supposedly God forbid, that he didn't want people to have knowledge. And so she did that, and then she got all excited with what she knew, and she had Adam also take a bite of the fruit so they would have equal knowledge. Now, it's interesting that the Ascended Masters who we've studied with said that God's main directive to people was make known the unknown, which is the exact opposite of the Adam and Eve story that says that you shouldn't seek knowledge. So you have to start to wonder where the story, who originated that part of Genesis, and for what reasons. And was it to control people's access to knowledge, and was it because the interesting thing is that a snake, according to the Greeks and their symbology, was the symbol of knowledge.
Oh.
But the Christians said that knowledge is like saying the knowledge is the devil, because they keep saying that the snake was the devil. So they keep trying to insinuate that this was a bad thing that happened, and because Eve did this, that women should be suppressed and not have an equal voice to a man, because of this, quote, original sin that St. Augustine cooked up.
Okay. Before we go any further, I know we captured a graphic of the Da Vinci Code book, so that if people happen to see it around and it catches their eye, they'll know what we're talking about as a reference. Again, this is a very important reference for the show, so if we could pull that graphic up. Okay, you can see that. And don't pull the graphic away yet, because what I wanted to talk about is that that's the picture of the Mona Lisa.
Yes.
As done by Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci.
Right.
And when you look at this, there is writing that is backwards across this picture that you would only be able to see in a mirror. And I believe that in some of Da Vinci's writings, he might have used English, possibly, and reversed it as to keep some of the information in code.
You have to remember that Da Vinci lived in the time of the Inquisition, and they were looking to burn everyone and anyone who went against the Catholic dogmas. So in order to protect himself, he learned how to write backwards, so that when people looked at this, they couldn't really decipher what it was too easily. And this is one of his ways that he could write down his thoughts and not have to worry that it would fall into Catholic hands and he would end up being burned at the stake.
Well, after all, a large portion of his income and his survival in his career was based on many paintings, many pieces of work that he did for religious organizations.
That's true.
So he was wise to do that, sort of like what Nostradamus did with writing in quatrains over time. The other thing, too, with respect to the Mona Lisa, that there's an overall sense of androgyny when you look at this woman, that her face has the characteristics of both male and female, and how there were societies there that were trying to protect the origins of the female, and we'll talk about which female we're talking about here in a moment. But yet, through some of these artists and these people who are members of these societies, they would try to get away with it in their arts. And in other words, what I'm saying is some of their anti-religious beliefs would come through. So a lot of this has been researched, not just by the people who wrote this book, but throughout the entire world.
There are some people who think that because they claim that the Mona Lisa is really a self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, and they claim that Leonardo was really a woman, and who was posing as a man because a woman would have absolutely no voice in the Renaissance. And this is a theory that's out there now. There's all sorts of theories. If he really belonged to the organization that they talk about in the book, then perhaps this was hidden, and because of this hidden knowledge, he's trying to portray something else, and someone who didn't have this knowledge could interpret it, thinking that he was a woman.
Okay.
So I don't know how much validity there is to that, but I have read that.
Now, the temptation in the Garden of Eden sort of set it up for women to be associated with evil, right?
Yes.
Does that sound plausible?
Yes, and even I have one quote here that comes from the first book of Timothy, chapter 2, verse 12. And it says, "But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man, but to be in silence." Women were not supposed to talk in church. Women were not supposed to even teach a man. And this, some people say, well, what difference does all this make? So it's in the Bible, big deal. And today we've gotten away from listening to the Bible as much as people did a long time ago. But if we go back into history, the Bible was followed very strictly. And in the city of Alexandria, in about the year 100, I believe, or 200, that city was not Christian at the time. Although there was, excuse me, I'm in the 300s or 400s. I'm in the wrong time period. I'm in the early 400s. There was a Archbishop Cyril who was presiding over the Christian part of that city, but the city was very pagan. And there was a woman whose name was Hypatia, and she was a mathematician. She was a brilliant woman, and I've read about her, and they said that people came from all over the ancient world to sit in her lectures because the things that she said were so brilliant. Well, she claimed that she got her knowledge through the divine feminine, and she was talking about the power of the goddess as well as mathematical things. Because you have to understand, back then, everything, science and math and religion were all combined. Even if you take Pythagoras, a lot of people have heard of the Pythagoras because of the Pythagoras theory dealing with the triangle. Okay, well, he had a secret society, and he belonged to a secret society mystery school, and he was teaching about ancient truths along with the mathematics. And apparently Hypatia was doing the same thing. Well, Cyril didn't like what was going on. Number one, she was a woman, and number two, she was a pagan. She was not following Christianity. So he incited the Christian mob, and they went and they similar to what we would call carjacking, they hijacked her chariot, and they dragged her into the church, and they tied her to the altar, and they took clamshells and gouged out all her flesh until she died. And this is what they did to this brilliant person, just because she was not spouting Christian tradition and Christian doctrine. So this is the way the early Christians treated pagans, and this is a classic example. So, and it goes, and Cyril used this particular verse, "I shall not suffer a woman to teach," to justify what he did.
So, excuse me, somebody just corrected you here by saying it was oyster shells, not clam shells.
Okay, that's true.
Oyster shells.
Yeah.
Wow.
With oyster shells, yeah.
Wow.
Oyster
I'm not that familiar with those shells to know the difference.
Now, for those
You're
of our
right,
viewers,
though, it was oyster shells.
Thank you. For those of our viewers that might be new to this, what Carl just did was receive information from someone in spirit to clarify what Sidney is saying. Now, you haven't necessarily read or knew that Sidney was going to read this today, but this information was given through you. And whenever I hear that myself, and the viewers should also realize this, that validates what Sidney said. That's like adding an exclamation point with a footnote on it.
And they were right, it was oyster shells. I made a mistake on that.
I would like to say this for the viewers, that there are two kingdoms. There's the kingdom of man, where we live, and there's the kingdom of spirit. Jesus tells the woman at the well that we're born with two bodies. No, he tells us through the medium that he had to use after he died. That was the end of his teaching of the gifts of the Spirit. He said that we're born with two bodies, a physical body and a spirit body. That means that God is within all people.
He said that
No
through
such
St. Paul.
thing. Huh?
He said that through St. Paul.
There's no such thing as a God up in the sky, simply because the God body within us vibrates on a very high frequency. Let's compare it to the FM of our radio, whereas the physical body operates in a frequency similar to the AM. So when they say he's from on high, this is where they got that business high from. There's no God out there. God is within here, but this God in here, and about 99% of everybody on the planet is asleep because we have been giving our power away to something that we think exists, doesn't exist.
Now, you're a reverend of a church,
Yes.
so people would think that God just spoke to you and shared that information with them.
It wasn't God, it was somebody in the world of spirit
Okay.
that just spoke to me. They are just as real as we are.
Thank you.
They see us, but we cannot see them unless they materialize, just as he did here to his wife and two children. That's going to shock a lot of people because he was married, that's his wife, and his first child was a little girl, Sarah, and the second child was a little boy, James, named after his brother, James. And the church has tried to cover it up, saying that she was a prostitute. The thing is, no other man would look her in the face because she had one eye was brown and the other eye was blue. They thought that was a very bad omen.
They thought that was a sign of the devil.
And so he never, this man, this great man, never judged anybody, nobody.
Now, you jumped ahead a little bit, but that's about what we're going to talk about. I shouldn't say we. In this book, one of the females, or information about a female in history that has been kept sacred by a secret society that had been created, called the Priory of Sion, which was also affiliated with the Knights of Templar. And it's very interesting how behind the scenes they're all really interconnected with the Masonic Temple and the Masons and so on and so forth. But the origination of a lot of this information came from Mary Magdalene herself.
Yes.
Who was in fact, see, you're saying this, that Jesus was married, this was his wife.
Absolutely.
She was considered a prostitute. Now, what are the chances
not
that...
a prostitute.
Right. But in this book, they also confirm that at that time she was considered a prostitute, but in fact she did marry him. She was his wife. And in the book they also talk about that they have a daughter, Sarah, and that there was a great society built up around protecting that information about the truth with respect to her being his wife and him being a man, not just what they proclaimed him to be, the son of God, at the Council of Nicaea.
Mary Magdalene was a prophetess or a priestess of the god Isis in Egypt, and she understood the secrets of that society. And when the Bible talks about that she washed her hair, she took her hair and washed his feet. That was one of the ceremonies that was conducted with Isis, from what I understand. And so she was very psychically aware. She understood psychic science very well as Jesus did. And this is probably a bond that they shared. One of the reasons that they probably, decided to get married in the first place, because they had this common understanding.
So I guess one of the big questions would be, why would they want to keep the information about her and the truth about who she really was secret all this time?
Well, it goes back to what we were just talking about, that women were not allowed to share this kind of knowledge. And Peter, he was the one who was very much with this. This concept goes back into Judaism, and Orthodox Judaism is still very much alive. If you ever enter an Orthodox synagogue, the women sit separate from the men, usually behind some sort of curtain, so the men can't see them. So the philosophy is still conducted today. So Peter was more in this kind of tradition and thought that all the disciples should be male, and that women shouldn't have any say in any of this, and probably not even follow. But
Wasn't it also true that Jesus was from the house of David?
Yes.
And Mary was from the house of Solomon? Supposedly. And so
Mary,
she
the,
had
Mary the
royal,
mother, or the Mary
Mary
Magdalene?
Magdalene. And that having these two royal bloodlines cross would create such power that the church would be powerless.
Solomon was the son of David, so it would be the same house.
Oh, okay, all right.
Mary Magdalene was one of the Essenes, not
Okay.
connected through blood to his mother.
Okay.
And his mother, Mary, he selected her because there were three men working together in the other dimension, the spirit dimension. One was Moses, one was Elijah, and the other one was Jesus. Jesus was the last of the three that joined with them. And they talked it over because the world was in such a mess. It was Jesus that volunteered to come back. And he lowered his vibrations 7 levels to vibrate at the same vibration that this young lady was, who was Mary, and she was only 13 years old. And he implanted himself in her womb to come into the world as a human being. This is the way it really happened. And when he came into the world, even as this little tiny baby, his control was Moses, and his teacher was Elijah. And so later on in his teaching with his 12 students, only 3 of them, Peter, James, and John, developed to his satisfaction, and he wanted them to finally witness who it was he was always talking to. So that's what happened on the Mount of Transfiguration when those 2 entities appeared, materialized, just as you see his body materialize this. Now, this painting was done by a woman in this area. She was a nun for 27 years, and she was always directed by, she didn't understand this because her religion did not teach her this. But she was always directed to do certain things, and she knew that they were absolutely against her religion, you see? So she got out from under that contract that she had signed, and now she does paintings. She just did this for me, and she feels the presence of 2 people, and I've seen these 2 entities standing, one on one side, one on the other, and they would take her by hand and move it over here, and she'd brush over here all the time. Her mind, she wanted to do it over here. That's how that was painted. I have the only picture of it on the planet. I was told, not by somebody on the earth plane here, but I was told by the masters in the other dimension, I have the only picture like it on the planet.
So then my question gets back to Mary Magdalene. I'm talking about Jesus's wife.
Yes.
She was a priestess, is
Yes.
what your research leads you to,
Yes.
to
Yeah.
know. And if she was a priestess, then she must have come from some type of royal background?
She
To be
came
that
from the
priestess?
highest family Essene society.
Okay, all right.
She would have studied the mysteries at the school and
Okay.
had evolved through that
Okay.
to that position.
Okay, because the book sets up this premise that having these 2 people together, Jesus and Mary Magdalene, would have been such a powerful combination because of who they were and where they came from, that they would really render the church powerless.
For the people that read the body and they know the Bible, and they notice that there's about 18 years of his life they have no record of. It was between the time he was 12 years old and Rabbi Barchi took him to the school of the Essenes, which is way out in the desert. There was an oasis there. And there was a lake, a small lake there, plenty of water, fishes, and they raised camels and other animals, and there was quite a few families that lived there, raised their children there, and it was called a hidden religion or secret society, and they would never divulge to anybody on the outside, but this Rabbi Barchi, he knew them, and they trusted him, and he was the one that talked to Joseph and Mary, and allowed the boy, Jesus now, to go with him, and he took him to that school. And when he got there, he realized that everything that they teach is what he already knows. With that knowledge, he wanted to go into India and those other countries and teach the people, and he did. So this is why there's 18 years of his life it's missing. I asked these questions, and I got my answers. Makes a lot of sense to me.
Now, I guess the next question would be, why would it be so important, other than Mary Magdalene being a female and her being in a scene, for them to cover up all this information? Because evidently she also wrote Gospels of her own.
Yes, there is a Gospel of Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
That
Do you
doesn't
know anything
exist.
about those Gospels?
I haven't had a chance to read it, but I know that it exists. You can get it in Barnes & Noble. It's been translated into English at this point. The other thing I wanted to bring out is that you have to realize that there's been a long tradition within the Jewish religion that started there and might have started in other places, that any other competing religions were thought they tried to put it in the worst possible light, and the best way of doing that is to put negative sexual connotations on it. And this is one of the reasons that they turned Mary Magdalene into a prostitute. She was a priestess of a religion that they didn't want to deal with, so therefore they made her into a prostitute.
Okay.
So the early Christians, following in the Jewish footprints, footsteps, would tend to do the same thing.
Okay. Now, there's also supposedly a link that keeping her information with respect to the Gospels was something important, to keep that out of the mainstream, because they could have been destroyed, these documents. Also, evidently, they had maintained her actual bones and body in a tomb, and then somehow all of that is linked or called or having something to do with the request or the seeking of the Holy Grail. And I wanted to know what you thought about that with the research that you have encountered.
Well, from what I understand, the Holy Grail, although for centuries it was thought to be the cup that Jesus drank from at the Last Supper, and Christians would think that it would be made out of gold and jewel encrusted and everything else. It has been something that's been sought after for a long time. King Arthur talks about looking for the Holy Grail. But in actuality, according to the Da Vinci Code, from what I understand, because I haven't had a chance to read the whole book, I've just read parts of it, the Holy Grail was really more talking about Mary Magdalene, because she was the bloodline, and to not only the divine, but also to future kings, people who became kings of England and of France, and eventually throughout all of Europe. And so this was thought to be the Grail, that it was holding the bloodline. And if you go back into history, one of the things, when a person became king, it was automatically assumed that his son would continue to become king on the concept of consanguinity, which is talking about sanguine, which is blood. It was the bloodline that they wanted to keep going. Okay. So this whole idea of divine rights of kings and consanguinity all ties into what this book is talking about, right, and is actually the basis for those things that came up later on in the Middle Ages.
Now, if you actually look at the Last Supper, you look at the table, they all have the same cups for the wine. How do you know which is which, if that were true?
Sure.
I'm bursting here. I've got to talk about this.
Go.
It was not the Last Supper. It was the last seance. And for the viewers watching this program, and if you don't know what a seance is French for a sitting. And at that time, he had an open upper room over a pottery shop that the woman gave that room to him because her husband had died. And she told him, if you will take your students, move all of those jugs and stuff down here on the street so I can sell them, then you can have that room to have your meetings. And they would sit in a circle, like I have done so many hundreds of times. It is a seance. But you can't have a seance unless there's a medium in the crowd. He was the medium. In those days, he was called a prophet. And so they would go into the altered state of consciousness. He would go into a trance state. And Moses, who had been dead 1,400 years, used to use his vocal cords to speak to those boys, teach them. He was teaching about the gifts of the Spirit. And so did Elijah do the same thing. He was the instrument, meaning the prophet, the medium. And that's all it was. And the writers changed it to the Last Supper. That's a bunch of hogwash.
Because they happened to be eating while they were having a seance.
Well, you always do. Having a seance and the energy it takes in the body, you're hungry as a bear. You really are. And every time I had a seance, I would gain weight after that because I'd eat too much, and then you go to bed, you're so tired. And so I've tried to control that these days.
So the cups there all show that Jesus didn't have a specific one that was different from any other.
Right.
So that kind of invalidates the notion of some kind of a chalice.
It
But the
was-
vessel could have been literally
It was a set
Mary's
of cups
womb.
that the old lady downstairs gave them. Gave
Okay.
every one of them
Really?
a cup
Really?
because she was into pottery business.
Okay.
And there was nothing painted
That makes
on
sense, doesn't
nothing
it?
painted on them.
Okay.
And there was not a table in that room either.
So the symbol of this chalice, or that which is going to hold the bloodline, was really Mary's womb that they're referring
Yes.
to, right?
Yes.
They created that so their followers would see that very fancy gold cup in the church and think nothing of it. Jesus had one like it.
Right.
Poor man didn't have no cup like that.
So it yet could be another icon for
Yes.
them
Mhm.
to
That's all
worship.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's all it
Okay.
was.
All right. Now, what about the idea in the book that Mary Magdalene was one of the disciples, one of Jesus'
Yes, she
disciples, and then there was
was.
some jealousy going
The
on?
boys were jealous of her because she was the only female there.
Now, you've gotten this information independently.
Absolutely. I didn't get it from a book.
No.
And I
Very
didn't get it
interesting.
from anybody in the physical.
Right.
Because I've asked questions. Because Jesus said in the Bible, according to the Bible now, he said, ask and you shall receive, knock and the door shall open. Well, I have never given up on asking questions. And my father used to say, you shouldn't ask questions like that, son. I said, why? He said, well, you just shouldn't. Maybe it's a secret of God or something. I said, well, why is he hiding things from us?
Right.
I used to think he was a big man out there somewhere, a giant.
If he
Well,
was,
so do most people.
if God was hiding things from it, it would make it a cult.
Yeah.
Because a cult means hidden.
You
Good
stop
point.
and think of that.
Good
They
point.
gave me a lecture one time. I'm not going to call out the religions. I really want to, but I'll let the viewers figure this one out.
Yeah, they will.
If they hide something from you, if it's hidden, it's an occult. Spiritualism, we deal with spirit because God is spirit. If people would only use their head and their own mind and think this through, think it through, you're going to have a lot more questions after that. Because you see, by my seeing people, invisible people, talking to them, hearing voices, and all of that when I was a little boy, I wanted to know some answers. I got them all.
Now, what's interesting is the research that has been done out there in the world, and some of that had been pulled into this particular book and made a story around it, is research that I'm guessing has taken the traditional researcher many, many, many years just to uncover very basic, tiny bits of this.
Little bits of it.
And what I've noticed, having known the two of you, is what happens is Carl is given usually some information about a place to go and something to look for. Sidney hears that. With your research skills and technology, you both go there together. You find that, and it will take you, just for example, a tenth of the time it would take somebody who could spend a whole lifetime uncovering a tiny piece.
Right.
So that also is a very interesting, powerful combination that the two of you put together.
Well, the one thing that I remember, I hope he doesn't tell the people that because it embarrasses me every time I hear it, but when they showed me visions of a place in Turkey, which is about 8,000 miles from here, it was just as if I was right there. And I talked to him about it, and one day he says, I think we should go to Turkey and see if we can find such a place. We did, but we searched quite a few days, and then 2 days before we were to come back, we found it. And I yelled and hollered and screamed so hard because I went out of my mind because it was exactly the place I saw in the vision. And he has pictures of it.
And the research based on that trip is actually coming out in a book.
Yes.
Yes.
And the book is called
Crossovers.
Crossovers.
And a lot of what's in crossovers happens to be in the Da Vinci Code. That's what was blowing my mind, was that Carl was listening to the audio tape. I haven't had a chance to read the book because I'm still putting the finishing touches on crossover. He says, you got to read chapter so-and-so, got to read this chapter. And I sit and read it, and I said, this is exactly what I got done writing. Couldn't get over it.
It is. I'm telling you, I can't tell you how many people who watched this program had read that book and for the factual information in it said, oh my goodness, that's the same information that has been on this program for years. And if nothing else, all it's saying is that it's coming out, folks, whether we share it with you or a man by the name of Dan Brown does and whoever he cited for research, it's coming out. You're going to have no choice but to open up your mind, think for yourself, throw your Bible out the window. Okay, that's all I have to say.
One other thing to the viewers, I am not looking for a following. I'm certainly not looking for a following. I've closed my church because of reasons beyond my control, and I have to move to the Carolinas, and because that's where I'm originally from. So I will be moving out of the area, but we'll still be making the tapes.
Oh yes, the shows will continue to be shown.
Yeah.
If not in this particular studio, which is Adelphia, out of Norwich, they will continue to be shown anywhere else that the FCC allows these shows to go. And guess what, folks? That's just about everywhere in the United States. So, you never know. If you live in another state and you're visiting a friend here in Connecticut and you see this show and you like it to come to your area, or perhaps you just want a copy of one of the shows that we're doing, you can contact the studio and we'll make it happen.
And remember, the title of the show will always be Making Known the Unknown, because that's what we're doing.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Now with that, there are just so many pieces. I don't even know where to continue, but one of the first ones that is also connected to the sacred feminine and keeping this whole feminine history, well, there's two things. People wanted to destroy it, so they developed a society to contain it and keep it. And some of the other pieces of this society that had been kept secret and that have been transformed and changed to have entirely different meanings today. One of those symbols is the symbol of the pentacle. And that really, really interested me when I read about that, and I wondered what the two of you had found with that, and I'll kind of set it up a little bit here. The idea had been that in the pagan religions, long time ago, when people would revere earth and nature and astronomy to help them heal people with herbs, or to look to the sky to understand the seasons perhaps, or when to plant a crop. One of the big constellations, or planets I should say, that had constellations around it, is Venus, or was Venus. Mm-hmm. And Venus being denoted feminine, and Venus appearing in the sky every 4 years. There would be some connection with cycles and seasons and the planet. And then Venus in the sky also portraying or symbolizing a five-pointed star, a five-sided star, and the pentacle having over the years had a meaning that was transformed into something very evil and satanic. And I found that very interesting, how it started out as something entirely different and then got switched over into something quite different. Any comments about that? Any thoughts?
Again, the church continued the Jewish tradition of taking anything that was pagan and turning it into evil. And so they took the pentagram, which was a holy symbol for the pagans, and made it and said it was a satanic symbol. Not that a Satan has existed, but they created it just to keep people away from it and fearful of it, because people who understand, the people that, let's say, who practice Wicca, okay, which is we call a pagan religion, a religion outside of Christianity. To them, the pentagram's a very important symbol and contains certain power, and they're able to work with that energy, and to keep people away from that energy so that they wouldn't use it. The Christians called it satanic, and when they get people to follow everything they say in blind, unquestioning faith, which is what they were supposed to do, then they would just follow along and believe that.
So along with creating Satan for the purpose of controlling people and leading them out of ignorance with fear, they just attached that sign to it and anything else that they didn't like about any other religions at that time.
Right.
You got to remember that the church was the first to make up the laws. Church used to make all the laws. And then there came a time when people became a little bit more educated, and they decided we got to stop this, and so there happened separation of church and state.
Okay.
You see?
All right.
But the church would make up all kinds of things that looked like a sin, and it was the devil's work and all of that. And there has never been such a thing as the devil. It was created by the church. There is no such thing as that. I've talked more about the devil and hell to those people that talk to me, and they've all said there's no such place. There's one entity who says, I have searched, I've searched throughout the universe, and there is no such place, there's no such person, no such entity as the devil. And they also told me recently a lot, and I've only mentioned it to you and Sid, is the fact that there's a tremendous amount of viruses on the planet, and they call one virus virus D, and the other one virus H. And so I finally got them to explain that to me.
What is that?
All right. Virus D is what the church created. It means the devil. And if they can use mind control to get people to believe that there's a devil, then that programming in the soul kicks in and shuts the brain off from understanding even what we're teaching here. And we're not getting paid a penny for this. We're doing it on our own. And people out there, if they believe in the devil, that becomes the virus that kicks in, and they will not understand a thing that we're teaching, and it won't sink in.
Okay.
Because they've got virus D.
All right.
And if they've got virus H, which is hell, and I heard this woman on a talk show the other night, she said, she was telling whoever it was that was doing the show, that she didn't want to go to hell and burn. I feel so sorry for these people that have been taught such garbage. There is no such place. And if there was a devil, why in the hell doesn't God destroy that bastard and get rid of him?
Right. Right.
Because if God created the earth and heaven and everything in between and gives life and take it away, why can't he zap that old whoever he is and get rid of him and bring peace on the planet?
Yeah.
It's all mind control.
Well, I'm guessing, too, that they're getting a lot of mileage, the churches are, from their history not too long ago of burning witches at the stake.
That's right.
So there's
Sure.
that fear right there. And there was I mean, that wasn't just a few, that was quite a few.
I was burned at the
Thousands.
stake right on the shore of the Thames River in London. I went there and I went there to visit London one time. And when I went for a walk and I walked onto this place, I had relived that whole place again. I had to get away from there. And then I talked with this woman about it because I was asking her about the street, and she told me, you know, since I was a tourist, she asked me had I been to such and such a place, and I said, yeah, but I'm not going to go back. There's a plaque up there where they were burned at the stake by the church. All these holy people burning them at the stake.
So there is all of this information that's been hidden,
It's been
hidden to protect it
Yeah,
from getting destroyed.
yeah.
Do you, either one of you, ever think that at some point there will be definitive information that will ever be revealed about some of the wrongs? Will they be righted?
It's too much money in religion. Money will buy everything. Money will buy anything on this planet. I hate to say it, but it's true.
You're talking about a hidden knowledge, and you have all the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in 1947. You have the scrolls in Egypt, the Nag Hammadi scrolls, which I think that's where they found the scroll of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the Gospel of Thomas. So you have all these scrolls that were hidden precisely because the Christians were burning everything in sight. If you actually examine go to research what the oldest manuscript of the New Testament is, it only goes back into, I believe, the 5th century. And the oldest Old Testament goes back into the 1100s because everything else that they burned. That's because Jerome was sitting there, editing the Bible and making it say what the Christians wanted it to say, and therefore they had to destroy all the originals because they changed so much of what was going on. When Jerome revealed his Bible, there were riots in the streets because people knew that it was changed and it wasn't right. So it wasn't even received well. So all the old things got destroyed, and these societies understood that. They understood that, and if this knowledge was to survive at all, it had to be buried for millenniums, and then perhaps in a more enlightened time, it could come out and survive.
I hope that in my lifetime I get to see some of that or witness some of that, because it would appear that now that this information is coming out in all shapes and forms, that it's leading up to something like that.
I would hope so.
Any thoughts or feelings about documents that would validate who Mary is being connected to a place called Rennes-le-Château in France? There supposedly was a tower there erected to her, for her, and there was a priest who was in charge of renovating an old church, and when they begun the renovation and underneath the altar, they found what appeared to be possibly one or more documents by which he evidently took, this is the theory, that he took these documents to the church and he became inordinately wealthy all of a sudden, when prior to that he had to beg for his food just to get by on a daily basis. Now, I looked some of this information up too, and I thought that that was interesting, that a lot of this, again, that comes from this book, you can go out and look up yourself on the internet.
There's something about that particular place. I remember seeing a video documentary about it, and there was something about that place in France. I don't remember all the details, but it turned out that there were 4 other places involved, and it created an exact pentagram. You were talking about the pentagram before, that it was an alignment that formed the pentagram.
Okay.
I don't remember too much about exactly what you're talking about, but I do know that that's one of the spots where they claimed that Mary Magdalene left Palestine and came into France,
Yeah.
and eventually that her bloodline was the start of the kings of France, the
Merovingian.
Merovingian bloodline,
Right.
which led into all the kings of France, and eventually throughout all the courts of Europe.
Now that ties in also to the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail,
Yes, it
does it
does.
not?
Yes.
Okay. Again, more information that comes out to validate this. What's funny is that months ago, I had met someone who had said to me, go to this website and look this up. I think you'll find this interesting. And I said, all right, I did. I printed it out. I put it aside, not knowing that I would ever use that to try to convey information in a show, or that it would be connected to a book that I would read, or that there would actually be some truth involved in the connection with Mary Magdalene. So that was a surprise to me. There was also another organization that seems to be connected to the church in this book that is actually in existence today. Again, I would take terms, I would go look them up and see where do they stand today. How much did this man deviate from what these institutions really stand for in this book versus now in this very day? And one of those organizations is called Opus Dei. Now, if you go to the website, it looks very, very spiritual, very helpful, very loving, very international. But when you start to dig a little deeper and you get into some of the topics, which actually scared me a little bit in the book, and I thought, oh, that can't be true. They talked about corporal mortification, which we'll talk about in a little more detail. It has to do with penance and sin and what have you. These institutions actually do acknowledge this. And there were many, many officials of the church that confirmed their existence and backed up a lot of the practices that they have even today on this particular website, which was their website. There was an individual in the book who wore what they call a silice, a strap on his leg, a leather strap that had prongs sticking in it, and it was a form of I'll call it self-torture, so that they would always remember, I guess, the pain that Jesus went through, so as to keep themselves in the same, I don't know what the word would be, keep themselves
in the same state of horror.
Thank you. Well, it would be a form of control, and they looked at it as a sense of honor to be able to do this. And I actually found where it said that on the road to Christian perfection, people have to mortify themselves more than ordinary believers are required to. And frequent fasting, silice discipline, abstinence is inclined. They're inclined to have to do this to stay away from evil because of the flesh and the devil and the connection therein. And I'm guessing what they mean by that is some kind of sexual abstinence, and by staying away from that, then they won't be tempted to do something.
Well, you
Whoa,
know,
what's that about?
it goes back to what Jesus' teachings about the 2 bodies. You have 2 bodies, a spiritual body and a physical body. And we tend to think that in order to commune with the spiritual body, you have to you can only use one body at a time. So you need to quiet down the physical body in order to raise the spiritual body. In other words, you go into a deep set of meditation, and as you do this, your physical body gets to be heavier and heavier, and you go into a spiritual realm. You're changing your state of consciousness. Well, the Christians kind of interpret the whole thing a different way, and they figure if you give the physical body enough pain, okay, that the spiritual body will take over. It's very incorrect, but that's what they're trying to get to. They're trying to make themselves more spiritual by punishing the physical body, and by maybe perhaps I've read that if a person's body is under a lot of stress and pain, that it releases endorphins, and the endorphins will give you a kind of high. So maybe they tie that into what's going on. But spiritually, it's all wrong. But that's what they're after.
Well, it almost seems like they're trying to be Christ-like and bring it out in themselves. Because if their understanding of Christ is what most people's are, is that he was sacrificed because of their sins, then if they live a sin-free life, they won't endure what he endured, which is going to be much, much more than they could ever imagine.
Well, you're right about that, because back in the medieval times, in the Middle Ages, this season we just entered into, the Lenten season. They would have this big Mardi Gras, there was Fat Tuesday, everybody celebrated and have a great time. But then come Ash Wednesday, everything turned very solemn. And certain people were commanded to go into church on a daily basis, and they'd be whipped there. And they'd have to go through all sorts of physical pain and things to get rid of the certain type of sin. It wasn't just saying Hail Mary and doing some prayers. They had to undergo some sort of physical pain, just as Jesus underwent physical pain, because supposedly he had no sin.
And they were being whipped by some type of clergy, I'm guessing?
Yes.
In these churches?
Mm-hmm.
You got to wonder, and I don't know why this came into my thoughts, but you got to wonder if this is where sadism and masochism originated.
It would have
you
had
know?
to originate
I don't know.
there.
Sure. It sounds crazy.
Yeah.
It really
Because
all
that
sounds
experience is recorded in the soul and held, and then when that person comes back in another body, they have that knowingness, that desire to do the same thing.
But see, it ties into this whole thing about punishing the physical to raise the spiritual.
Yeah.
It's tied into that same concept.
Right. Wouldn't it seem easier and less painful to be able to shut your physical down by meditation than beating yourself?
But if you did that, Tina, you might connect with God within, and the Catholics didn't really want you to do that. They wanted you to see Jesus on the cross or up in the sky or whatever.
Right.
So no, they didn't want that to happen.
Well, my goodness, you'd have thoughts and feelings that would come in. You wouldn't know what to do with them. Then you'd go to a minister or a priest to ask about them, and they'd tell you that you're being tempted by the devil and stop what you're doing.
That's right.
Right?
And be whipped for a certain amount of times, and you'll be
there
just
you go.
fine.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's like so maybe saying several Hail Marys is like a watered-down version of this, perhaps,
Yes.
right?
Well, that's because all the corporal punishment went out of style many years ago.
But you know what?
When they couldn't get away with the burnings and the whippings and all that stuff.
But Sid, it didn't. This organization right now throughout the world has members who do this.
But that's a small percentage of the population.
Okay.
For the big percentage, they're not doing it.
But this organization has a lot of money.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of power.
Mm-hmm.
And the other question that I wanted to ask is, they evidently saved the Vatican with lots of money when they were about to go bankrupt. You ever hear anything about that?
Yes, I did. I was told it from the other dimension that there was a bishop out there. I couldn't figure out where he was on the planet, and I wondered where he got all the money from. He sent them. It was into the billions, not just millions.
Right.
Billions of dollars, because just a few months ago, the Vatican Bank was about to go under because of paying off all of these sex crimes and stuff.
So the Catholic Church is in debt to this organization.
Did you see the thing on the TV last night?
No, I didn't.
Something else has been revealed. This is worse than anything else.
This organization I thought, okay, they exaggerated this in the book and so on and so forth. And they may be doing good and kind things to people around the world, but it scares me that the core and the basis and the foundation of being more Christ-like involves this. Of course, abstinence isn't an unusual idea. Mm-hmm. Abstaining,
right.
Good Friday, Lent, blah, 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 the whole thing. But this is extreme, and they validate that this is okay now. Even church leaders at higher levels and bishops quoted and made comments on these practices Otherwise, I wouldn't put them in this show because it would be hearsay.
Sure.
They quoted them and they validated this. That's scary. This is so scary. And then they have a lot of money behind them, and look what, well, money can buy anything, right?
Yep, that's
Well,
true.
they're urging me here to say something that I don't like to say this. I've said it once before. But they've told me to say it once again, that anyone who has a cross in their house and Jesus is hanging on it, that person is just as guilty as the ones that were shouting to crucify him. And he says, if you've got to have somebody with hanging on a cross suffering, and you pray to him, I think they should pray to get somebody to take it off the wall and get rid of it. And if they have to have a cross, just have a cross, not somebody hanging on the cross.
We could get into the symbology of the cross, too, and all of that, which is very interesting. So I encourage people to read more and learn more.
When Jesus came to the world, he was teaching his 12 students the gifts of the Spirit and how to shut down the physical and raise the spirit and go forward and teach other people. This was his plan. This was his dream. And the people, all of the people started following him, the stranger, and ignoring the priest. And this started hurting them pretty soon, so that for the first time they got together, the priests. They wouldn't talk to each other because they were all jealous of each other. The one that had the most, the largest number of followers was the richest. And so when they got together, the priest did, it was the priest that had him killed.
Very interesting.
Get rid of him because he's competition.
Well, guess what? The next show we're going to do, which is Murder of a Medium, is going to talk exactly about that.
Right.
And what I'm going to do right now, because we only have a few minutes left, is I'm going to throw out your opportunity just to have a couple of final comments, and then they'll wrap up the show. Sidney, anything you want to share with people?
The Da Vinci Code is a very interesting book from what I've read. The history there is of the Catholic Church is portrayed very accurately. In fact, there were things that I hadn't come across, which was definitely helpful for my research.
Okay. Carl?
Well, my feeling towards the viewers would be for them to think for themselves, because Jesus himself said to me, now this is heavy for a lot of people to believe, but if back in the Bible time, the biblical age, a lot of people heard voices, and they always said, well, the voice of the Lord spoke to me. And in this case, it was Jesus who was talking to me, and he said that the people, they all have a brain and they have a mind, and he says, tell them to use it. And if they would ask the Lord God of their being within to give them the answer will come, not to go somewhere else to do it.
Good.
Not
Thank
even come
you.
to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Sidney.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you to our viewers for making an effort to open up your mind. It could be painful, but sometimes growth usually is. And I want to wish you well. I want to remind everybody that we have an address that you can send to request the book, My First Encounter with an Angel. There's also an email address, making_known@yahoo.com. And the phone number is area code 860-443-3201. And we will see you next time. Be well.